No record marked the precise moment of its beginning. There had been no storm in the void, no rupture in the veil of stars, no omen recognized by the vigilant choirs of the Imperium. The outpost designated Halcyon the Eight drifted as it had for decades upon the dim edge of a forgotten sector, its purpose minor, its existence tolerated rather than remembered. It was a listening post, nothing more. Its arrays turned outward toward the silent black, gathering fragments of distant signals that no one of consequence would ever hear. Within its narrow halls, routine had hardened into ritual. Servitors traced their endless paths along worn metal grates. Officers recited data as though scripture. The air smelled faintly of incense and machine oil, a blend that dulled the senses into obedience. Nothing changed there. Nothing was meant to, until the corridor appeared. It was first noted by a junior engine seer, whose duties confined him to the maintenance rings beneath the station's primary spine. He recorded a discrepancy in the structural schematics, a passage where none had been sanctioned. At first, it was dismissed as error. Such things occurred. Data degraded, machines faltered. Faith corrected what logic could not. Yet the passage remained. It did not intrude violently upon the structure. There was no tearing of bulkhead or distortion of metal. Rather, it existed as if it had always been there, a seamless extension of the station's design, its walls clad in the same pale plating, its floor bearing the same utilitarian grating. And yet, it led nowhere that should exist. When the engine seer returned with his superior, the corridor had lengthened. It stretched farther than the station's known dimensions would allow, its perspective narrowing into a vanishing point that seemed to retreat the longer one observed it. The lumen strips overhead flickered not with the erratic failure of aging systems, but with a deliberate cadence, as though responding to an unseen rhythm. The air within it felt wrong, not stale, nor contaminated. It was simply absent of quality, as though stripped of all properties that could be measured or named. Sound entered it reluctantly. Footsteps lost their echo. Even the quiet hum of the station's machinery seemed to hesitate at its threshold. Orders were given. The corridor was to be sealed. Bulkhead doors were deployed, sanctified and reinforced with the sigils of protection. Incantations were spoken. The machine god was invoked to recognize the flaw and purge it from existence. The doors closed. The corridor remained. It was found again the following cycle, not behind the sealed bulkhead, but elsewhere 2 levels above, adjoining a storage bay that had not been opened in years. The same corridor, the same pale walls, the same vanishing distance, and it was longer. This time a survey team was dispatched. 5 personnel, 2 armsmen, 1 engine seer, 1 officer, and a sanctioned psyker whose presence was deemed necessary despite the unease it inspired. They entered with caution, their movements measured, their senses strained against the unnatural stillness. At first, nothing occurred. The corridor extended forward in perfect uniformity. No markings distinguished one section from another. No intersections offered deviation. It was a straight line, absolute and unwavering. Their progress was tracked, their vitals monitored. Each step confirmed the same reality they moved, yet the distance ahead did not diminish. After several minutes, the officer ordered a halt. He turned. The entrance was gone. Where the threshold had been, there was only more corridor, identical, indistinguishable, infinite, in both directions. Panic did not erupt. It was trained out of them long ago. Yet something colder took its place, a recognition that their understanding had failed them, and that no doctrine provided guidance for what now enclosed them. The psyker spoke then, not loudly, nor with authority, but with a quiet certainty that unsettled the others more than any alarm could have. He claimed the space was not empty. He claimed it was aware. They did not believe him. They could not afford to. Yet, as they resumed their advance, each member of the team began to feel it, a subtle pressure at the edge of perception, like the weight of unseen attention pressing against the mind. Time became uncertain. Their instruments continued to function, yet their readings contradicted one another. Minutes stretched into hours without confirmation. Fatigue set in without the passage of duration. Hunger gnawed despite the proximity of recent sustenance. Then came the sound. It began as a faint disturbance, barely distinguishable from the imagined echoes of their own movement. A second set of footsteps, slightly out of rhythm. Not ahead, not behind, somewhere between. They halted. The sound ceased. They moved again. It returned, closer this time. The armsmen raised their weapons, though there was nothing to aim at. The corridor remained empty, its uniformity unbroken, its silence otherwise absolute. The psyker whispered again. He insisted they were not being followed. He insisted they were being preceded. The distinction was lost upon them, yet its implication settled heavily in their thoughts. The officer ordered a retreat, though no direction could be confirmed as such. They turned as one and began to walk, their pace quickening, their discipline fraying at the edges. The sound persisted, step for step, closer. One of the armsmen broke formation. It was not a conscious act. One moment he walked beside his comrades, the next he was gone. No cry marked his departure. No trace remained. The corridor simply continued, unchanged, as though he had never existed. The others did not stop. They could not. The pressure within the air intensified, pressing against their senses, dulling thought, eroding certainty. The lumen strips above flickered faster now, their cadence accelerating into something that resembled a pulse. The psyker fell to his knees. He clutched at his head, his voice rising into a strained murmur that bordered on hysteria. He spoke of layers of corridors beneath corridors, of spaces folded into themselves, of an architecture that consumed not matter but meaning. He spoke of an exit. He pointed ahead, and for the first time the corridor changed. Far in the distance, barely visible, there was a break in the uniformity, a shadow where light should have been, a deviation from the endless repetition. It did not approach as they moved. It remained fixed, unreachable, yet undeniably present. Hope, fragile and desperate, took hold. They advanced. The sound behind them quickened. Closer still, the remaining armsman turned to fire, his weapon discharging into the empty corridor with a deafening report that seemed to vanish before it could echo. The recoil staggered him, and in that instant, he too was gone. No transition, no explanation, only absence. The officer did not look back again. He dragged the psyker to his feet and forced him forward, toward the distant shadow that refused to grow nearer. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the corridor resisted their movement, as though it sought to hold them within its endless span. The sound reached them, not as footsteps now, but as something else, something that mimicked the rhythm of movement without possessing form. It surrounded them, passed through them, echoed within them. The psyker screamed. The officer saw nothing, and then, without warning, he was alone. The corridor stretched before him. The shadow remained distant. The sound was gone. He stood there, breathing hard, his thoughts unraveling as the weight of isolation pressed upon him. There was no sign of his companions, no indication they had ever been present. Only the corridor, endless, silent, watching, far beyond Halcyon V8. No signal marked their disappearance. No alarm was raised. The station continued its quiet vigil, its routines unbroken, its purpose unchanged. Yet within its depths, the corridor endured. It shifted, it lengthened, and it waited. The silence that followed Halcyon V8's disappearance was not immediate in its recognition. Within the vast administrative body of the Imperium, silence was common, and absence of communication rarely signified anomaly. Worlds fell mute for centuries before attention returned to them. Entire sectors drifted unobserved beneath the burden of greater wars. Yet this silence carried a subtle distortion. Astropathic choirs stationed at relay sanctums along the segmentum fringe began to report fractures in their communion. Messages arrived not as coherent transmissions, but as layered impressions, images folded within sensation, sensations embedded within prayer. Every attempt to interpret them yielded the same unsettling pattern. Corridors without origin, angles that did not resolve into Euclidean certainty, and endless passageways that seemed to turn inward upon themselves. The Adeptus Administratum classified the phenomenon as a signal corruption event. Such things were not uncommon near the galactic edges. Data degradation, warp interference, psychic overload all offered sufficient explanation. The matter might have ended there, as so many did, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. But then the picked records arrived. They came from a secondary relay vessel dispatched to investigate the silence. The ship, designated Vigilant Accord, had entered the Halcyon the 8th system without incident. No distress signals, no signs of hostile engagement. Only the station, intact yet unresponsive, rotating slowly in the void like a sealed reliquary. When boarding teams crossed the threshold, they did not find ruin. They found repetition. Every corridor within the station mirrored another, yet not through design. The geometry itself appeared to refuse distinction. Measurements recorded by cogitators contradicted themselves. A hallway measured at 40 meters would, upon remeasurement, extend to 60, then collapse back to 20 without physical alteration. It was as if space could not decide what it was. The picked records showed adepts walking through identical passages that led into identical passages, each junction folding into itself with no true divergence. Even the act of turning left or right became ambiguous. Direction lost meaning where every orientation resolved into the same structure. Then came the loss of the survey team. Unlike Halcyon the 8th's initial disappearance, this event was recorded in full. The picked feed captured their progression into a chamber that should not have existed. It was vast, yet dimensionless, its walls stretching into perspectives that contradicted visual logic. Lines converged where they should have diverged. Angles formed impossibilities that induced cognitive strain in even the most augmetic minds. One by one, the explorers began to lose coherence. Their instruments failed first, not through malfunction, but through disagreement. Gyroscopic stabilizers rotated without axis. Mapping devices produced overlapping schematics that could not coexist. Then the minds followed. The picked feed recorded adepts staring into corners where no corners existed, whispering calculations that resolved into contradictions. Some attempted to sketch the environment, only for the drawn lines to shift upon completion, reconfiguring into new shapes that bore no resemblance to their origin. The chamber responded. Not physically, but perceptually. Its geometry altered in response to observation. The more it was measured, the less it agreed with itself. At the moment of collapse, the recording showed the chamber folding inward. Not collapsing, not exploding, but reinterpreting its own spatial logic. Walls inverted into ceilings. Depth became proximity. Distance ceased to function as a concept. The feed terminated. What remained was a single frame of impossible symmetry, a corridor extending in all directions at once, each path identical, each endpoint indistinguishable from the next. Within the Ordo Malleus, the phenomenon was not immediately classified as heresy. That designation required intent, and intent could not yet be proven. But among the scholars assigned to the data, unease grew into reluctant recognition. This was not warp incursion. It was structure. Something had imposed order upon the void, but not an order that obeyed creation. It was an architecture that rejected definition, a geometry that refused finality. The laws of space did not bend within it. They dissolved into equivalence. An expedition was sanctioned, not of soldiers alone, but of mathematician priests, void engineers, and sanctioned psychers whose minds were calibrated to endure paradox. Their purpose was not conquest, nor destruction, but comprehension. The Imperium named them the cartographic ascendants, though no official record would later agree on whether the title was earned or imposed. They entered the Halcyon system aboard the vessel Lex Mechanic Continuum. From the moment of arrival, instruments failed to maintain consistency. Star charts overlaid themselves with conflicting readings. The station appeared both closer and farther with each observation cycle. Even the void surrounding it seemed uncertain of its boundaries, as though space itself hesitated to define proximity. The boarding was conducted without resistance. There was nothing to resist. Inside, the ascendants advanced with disciplined precision. Every step was measured, every marking recorded. Walls were inscribed with mathematical notation to anchor perception. Each corridor was assigned numerical identity, yet the numbers did not remain stable. Equations rewritten upon surfaces without physical contact. summations resolved into alternate results when observed from different angles. The act of documentation became an act of transformation. One of the ascendants, Magos Logician Threx, 9, noted the first formal contradiction within the structure. A corridor measured as parallel to itself from two distinct observation points. When plotted, the lines converged in a location that should not have existed within the station's dimensional constraints. He named it a heretical geometry. The designation was not theological at first, it was analytical. But as further anomalies accumulated, the term acquired weight beyond mathematics. The structure was not merely inconsistent, it was recursive. Every passage led not to a destination, but to a reformulation of passage itself. Movement did not traverse space, it redefined it. The station was no longer a construct within reality. It was a system that modified reality through observation of its own interior. Then the ascendants encountered the repetition chamber. It matched the picked record exactly, yet differed in scale. Vast beyond measurement, yet enclosed without boundary. The moment they entered, their instruments synchronized into contradiction. Depth readings inverted. Mass calculations nullified each other. Even time registers began to loop irregularly, producing sequences that repeated without temporal cause. And within that chamber, they observed the corridor. The same corridor Halcyon the Eighth had reported, endless, unresolved, watching them as they watched it. One by one, the ascendants began to fall silent, not from death, but from cognitive disassembly. Their interpretations fractured under the pressure of irreconcilable structure. Some attempted to redefine the geometry through ritual computation. Others invoked machine liturgies designed to stabilize spatial coherence. None succeeded. The chamber did not reject them. It incorporated their observation into its design. When the last transmission was received, it contained no distress, no report, only a single unresolved imperium repeated across every communication channel. That existence within the structure could not be separated from perception of it. And then the signal collapsed. Outside the station, the Lex Mechanic Continuum recorded a final reading before its instruments failed entirely. The Halcyon system, once stable, now appeared layered multiple versions of the same spatial arrangement overlapping without hierarchy, as if the universe itself had begun to consider alternative arrangements of being. And within that reconsideration, the corridor persisted, extending not through space, but through the certainty that space once held. The designation of Halcyon the Eighth was formally struck from most active Imperial charts only after the third relay failure. By then, its absence was no longer an isolated anomaly but part of a widening pattern stretching across adjacent listening stations. Each node that attempted direct observation returned altered data, and each alteration followed the same unsettling structure: repetition without origin, symmetry without cause, corridors without terminating geometry. Yet it was not until the astropathic choir of Lamentis Prime broke into discord that the phenomenon was acknowledged as something more than administrative decay. The choir did not scream. They resonated. Every psyker stationed within the lattice of Lamentis began transmitting simultaneously, their minds no longer functioning as individual conduits, but as overlapping vessels for a shared impression. The message they produced was not spoken, nor written, but experienced directly by all who received it. It was a corridor, not described, but entered. Those attuned to the transmission reported immediate cognitive displacement. They found themselves standing within an endless passage, identical in structure to those recorded at Halcyon the Eighth, yet stripped of physical anchoring. There were no walls in the material sense, only the perception of enclosure sustained by collective observation. Within this shared impression, something else persisted: footsteps, not approaching from any direction, but embedded within the rhythm of thought itself. Each recipient of the transmission experienced them differently, some behind, some ahead, some moving in parallel with their own mental cadence. Yet all accounts agreed on one certainty: the sound was not external. It was integrated. The choir collapsed within moments, not through death, but through synchronization failure. Their individuality dissolved into a single continuous signal that persisted for precisely 17 seconds after physical brain activity ceased. During that interval, the signal transmitted a series of spatial coordinates that did not correspond to any known region of real space. Then silence returned. The Ordo Malleus convened in secrecy aboard the fortress vessel Sanctum Veritas. The assembled record keepers and sanctioners debated the nature of the phenomenon, though debate itself grew increasingly unstable as contradictory data accumulated in real time. Some argued for warp contamination, though no daemonological signatures were present. Others proposed xenostructural influence, though no material evidence supported external origin. A minority suggested something more dangerous, that the anomaly was not invading reality, but redefining the criteria by which reality recognized intrusion. It was at this juncture that the echoes began. They were first detected within void communication relays stationed beyond the Lamentis corridor of space. Standard transmission channels registered faint distortions, repeating fragments of corrupted data that resembled speech, though no linguistic pattern could be stabilized. Initially dismissed as machine error, the echoes increased in clarity over subsequent cycles. What began as indistinct noise evolved into structured repetition. Words could be partially discerned, though never consistently across separate recordings. One fragment repeated across multiple systems. Still within, no origin point could be identified. The echoes did not propagate from a source. They appeared simultaneously within every listening apparatus that attempted reception, as though the act of observation itself generated the signal. Analysis teams attempted triangulation. All efforts failed. Each calculation returned contradictory spatial vectors, as though the signal occupied every coordinate at once without occupying any coordinate at all. The phenomenon escalated when entire monitoring stations began reporting internal echoes independent of external input. Personnel stationed within relay hubs heard voices within sealed chambers, though no transmission was active. Some reported hearing their own thoughts spoken back to them seconds after conception. A pattern emerged. The echoes always arrived after awareness. Never before. Always following recognition of silence. On the seventh cycle of escalation, a deep-range probe designated Null Vector 17 was dispatched to the last known coordinates associated with Halcyon Zero's structural anomaly. It carried no crew, only observation engines and self-contained logic arrays designed to function independent of sensory corruption. The probe did not return data. It returned structure. Its final transmission contained no visual or auditory information. Instead, it delivered a complete spatial model of an environment that should not have existed within its recorded position. The model was internally consistent, yet externally irreconcilable. Every corridor connected to every other corridor without intersection, forming a continuous topology that defied dimensional closure. Embedded within the model were echoes, not as sound, but as annotations. Each corridor contained within its structure repeated segments of informational residue, fragments of previous observations, partial reconstructions of prior transmissions, and residual impressions of entities that had never been physically present within the probe's trajectory. Among these residues, one pattern repeated with increasing frequency: the sensation of being followed by one's own observation. At the moment of data stabilization, the probe ceased all transmission. Its systems did not fail. They synchronized. Within Imperial analysis chambers, the model manifested across multiple displays simultaneously. Each viewing generated slight variations in structure, none of which could be reconciled into a single consistent interpretation. Observers reported increasing difficulty distinguishing between the model and the act of observing it. One Magos archivist recorded that the longer he studied the projection, the more certain he became that it was studying him in return. He was not the only one. Within hours, similar reports emerged from every station that accessed the data. Personnel began experiencing echoes within their own cognitive processes. Thoughts repeated themselves with slight delays. Decisions arrived already anticipated. Perception no longer functioned as input, but as confirmation of something already occurring elsewhere. Then came the breach. Without warning, multiple relay systems across the Lamentis corridor simultaneously broadcast identical transmissions. Each contained the same sequence: a layered repetition of coordinates, symbols, and fragmented phrases that resolved into no known code. But within the repetition, a pattern emerged that no analytical system could ignore. The echoes were converging, not spatially, but structurally. Every recorded instance of the anomaly Halcyon-wide, the cartographic ascendants, the labyrinths chaya, the null vector probe shared identical internal architecture, not in physical form but in relational design. Each was a variation of the same impossible corridor expressed through different scales of observation. The realization did not arrive as conclusion. It arrived as echo. And within that echo, all listening stations recorded the same final fragment, transmitted without source, without origin, without identifiable carrier. You are still within. Then the signal ceased. Not abruptly, but as though it had never begun. The cessation of the echo did not restore silence, it only refined it. Across the Imperium's fringe observatories, communication networks fell into a state of uneasy equilibrium. No further transmissions emerged from the labyrinths corridor, yet neither did the system return to its prior stability. Instead, every instrument capable of recording spatial data began to register a persistent deviation, a subtle misalignment between observed position and calculated certainty. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not describe it as error. They described it as drift. At first, the drift measured in fractions too small to matter, a star slightly displaced from predicted orbit, a relay buoy returning coordinates that diverged by imperceptible margins, a chart that refused to align with itself when overlaid upon previous iterations. Then the divergence multiplied. Entire regions of mapped space began to contradict their own archival records. Sectors thought stable revealed inconsistencies that could not be resolved through recalibration. The more frequently a region was observed, the more unstable its recorded structure became. It was as though observation itself was eroding certainty. Within the upper conclaves of the Ordo Malleus and the Mechanicum's exploratory synods, a conclusion emerged that no one spoke aloud at first. The anomaly was no longer localized. It was not expanding through space. It was propagating through comprehension. Thus, the Ctographers of madness were sanctioned. They were not formed in ceremony, nor born from unified decree. Their creation was an accumulation of necessity layered upon desperation. Void mathematicians were drawn from failing observatories. Navigational savants were extracted from fleets that had lost their charts. Psychers, trained in spatial divination, were bound under oath and restraint, their abilities recalibrated towards structural interpretation rather than prophecy. Their purpose was singular: to map what refused to remain mapped. They were given no name initially, only designation, iteration cohort sigma null. But among themselves, they adopted the title that would later appear in forbidden archival fragments, Ctographers of Madness. Their first assembly occurred aboard the station Mnemosyne Crucible, a drifting reliquary of data engines and fractured cogitation cores positioned beyond the Lamentis fracture zone. It was chosen precisely because its internal geometry was already compromised, making it theoretically more resistant to further distortion. The assumption proved incorrect. Upon initiation of the cohort's primary survey protocols, the station began to alter. Not structurally, but interpretively. Hallways previously recorded as linear began to register as recursive loops when measured under different cognitive frameworks. Distance within the station fluctuated depending on the observer's analytical method. Two adepts walking the same corridor would report incompatible lengths, neither of which could be disproven without invalidating the other. Mago's archivist Virex Theta, assigned as principal coordinator, documented the first true contradiction within 12 hours of activation. A mapping array projected a complete schematic of the station's interior. Simultaneously, a second array calibrated to identical parameters projected a different structure occupying the same spatial coordinates. Both were mathematically valid. Both were mutually exclusive. When cross-referenced, the systems attempted reconciliation. The result was not convergence, but multiplication. A third structure emerged, then a fourth, each derived logically from the previous two yet incompatible with all preceding models. The Ctographers did not cease operations. They adapted. New methodologies were developed in real time. Observation was decoupled from interpretation. Measurement was separated from validation. The cohort attempted to stabilize the phenomenon by accepting all contradictory models simultaneously, layering them into composite structures that could not be reduced to singular truth. It was during this phase that the first cognitive fractures appeared. Adepts began to experience displacement between map and territory. Those studying the station's structure reported walking corridors that no longer matched any recorded schema, yet still produced valid data under alternative analytical frameworks. Reality ceased to be singular, and instead became conditional upon method of observation. The station responded. Gradually, without visible alteration, Mnemosyne Crucible began to align itself with the cohort's models. Corridors extended where projected lines suggested expansion. Junctions appeared where probability distributions indicated necessity. Entire sections of the station reorganized themselves into compliance with incompatible blueprints simultaneously. It was no longer being mapped. It was mapping itself through them. Then the first cartographer disappeared. Magos Logician Sereth Null was last recorded entering a corridor that existed in only 2 of 7 concurrent models. His final transmission indicated no distress. Instead, he reported a successful convergence event, stating that he had located the agreement between all structures. After that, his signal fragmented. Subsequent analysis of his last transmission revealed that it contained embedded within it a complete recalculation of the station's geometry, one that invalidated every prior model while remaining internally coherent. Upon integration into the cohort's systems, the recalculation caused immediate divergence across all mapping arrays. Sereth Null was not found again, but his model persisted, and it began to replicate. As the cohort expanded its survey, more cartographers vanished. Each disappearance coincided with the emergence of a new structural interpretation, each more comprehensive than the last. No evidence of death was recorded. No trace of departure existed. Only absence coinciding with improved understanding. The station itself began to echo, not with sound, but with residual structure. Previously charted corridors would briefly reconfigure into configurations last associated with missing personnel. Mapping arrays would spontaneously display annotations authored in styles belonging to adepts no longer present. The cartographers realized they were not merely observing transformation. They were being incorporated into it. Panic, when it finally emerged, did not take the form of disorder. It manifested as overcorrection. Teams attempted to isolate contradictions, sealing off sections of the station that defied reconciliation. Yet each sealed corridor reappeared elsewhere within the mapping systems, often with greater stability than before. The act of exclusion only strengthened inclusion. Within 48 cycles, Mnemosyne Crucible could no longer be represented as a single structure. It existed instead as a superposition of all recorded interpretations, each valid, each active, each competing for dominance without resolution. The cohort fractured. Some cartographers attempted withdrawal, but found that exit routes no longer corresponded to prior mappings. Others embraced the multiplicity, surrendering to the notion that coherence was an obsolete concept. A final group attempted containment through recursive observation, believing that repeated measurement might stabilize fluctuation. Instead, it accelerated it. On the 61st cycle, Magos archivist Virex Theta issued the final cohort report. It contained no diagrams, no coordinates, only a single assertion repeated across all transmission channels, that the station had ceased to be a location and had become a question, and that every attempt to answer it was producing new versions of the question itself. After transmission, the cohort systems registered one final anomaly, a complete absence of unobserved space. Every corridor, every chamber, every structural possibility existed simultaneously within active mapping fields. And somewhere within that infinite overlay, something began to move in response to being defined. The first fracture in divine communication was not immediately recognized as such. Within the Imperium, silence was a familiar condition of the void, and even the most disciplined astropathic choirs endured intervals of distortion where the Emperor's light arrived, attenuated, fragmented, or delayed by the shifting tides of the imperium. Thus, when the choirs of segmentum obscurus reported diminished clarity, it was recorded as variance rather than crisis. Yet the variance did not stabilize. Instead, it propagated. Across relay sanctums, astropathic conduits began to experience a uniform deviation in transmission quality. Messages that once carried the unmistakable weight of imperial sanction arrived incomplete, as though portions of meaning were being removed during passage rather than lost to entropy. Entire doctrinal passages vanished mid-transmission, leaving only structural remnants of prayer without content. At first, the ecclesiarchy attributed this to warp turbulence. The tides of unreality were known to fluctuate, and such disturbances had been endured since the earliest ages of interstellar expansion. Ritual reinforcement was increased. Choirs were purified. Additional layers of psychic insulation were imposed. But the distortion deepened. The missing portions of transmission did not remain absent. They were replaced, not with corruption, nor with heretical influence in any recognizable form, but with structured absence, intentional gaps that appeared to follow a pattern too consistent to be random. Entire segments of liturgy were replaced with spatial impressions. Corridors described in devotional language stripped of meaning, passages of sacred scripture rewritten as architectural sequences. Where once there had been invocation, there was now description. Where once there had been faith, there was now structure. Within the sanctum Astra Telepathica, senior overseers began to compile these anomalies into unified reports. It was there that the first troubling correlation emerged. Every corrupted transmission, regardless of origin point or choir lineage, contained within its distorted structure a recurring motif: the presence of enclosed passageways without terminus, and the sensation of movement without progression. These motifs were not metaphorical. They were consistent across psychers who had no contact with one another, across systems separated by light years of void, across disciplines that should have rendered such uniformity impossible. The ecclesiarchy responded with escalation of ritual intensity. Entire choirs were subjected to synchronized invocation cycles designed to reinforce the psychic conduit to the Golden Throne. It was believed that the Emperor's presence would reassert clarity through sheer theological reinforcement. For a brief interval, stability appeared to return. Then the silence deepened further. On the 23rd cycle of reinforced communion, every astropathic relay within the obscurus lattice simultaneously ceased transmission. There was no warning, no degradation, no gradual fading. The cessation occurred as a single event across thousands of nodes, as though an external condition had been applied uniformly to all channels of contact. The effect was immediate and absolute. The Emperor's voice, as interpreted through the astropathic medium, was no longer accessible. Panic did not emerge at first. Instead, there was confusion, followed by procedural attempts at re-establishment of contact. Choirs were reassembled, rituals were recalibrated. Psychic conduits were expanded beyond standard operational limits. Nothing returned. Then came the reports. From isolated systems along the fracture boundary, accounts began to surface, describing a peculiar phenomenon within the silence. Astropaths who entered trance-state communion no longer encountered the familiar radiance associated with imperial presence. Instead, they reported vast structural impressions within the psychic void. Corridors. Endless, repeating corridors. Not experienced as vision, but as environment. Within these impressions, many psychers described a sensation of being observed by something that did not occupy a singular point of awareness. It was not presence in the conventional sense, but distribution attention dispersed across an uncountable multiplicity of identical structures. Some described hearing a rhythm within the silence, not speech, not thought, but something akin to alignment, as though reality itself was attempting to organize perception into a coherent passage. The Ordo Hereticus classified these reports as psychic contamination. Purges were authorized. Entire relay sanctums were subjected to cleansing protocols, their choirs silenced permanently to prevent further spread of the phenomenon. Yet, even within suppression, the pattern persisted. Recovered astropathic records from terminated choirs revealed identical internal structures across all final transmissions. Regardless of origin or linguistic formulation, each contained a final recursive element, the transformation of invocation into spatial continuity and of prayer into passage. The Emperor's silence, once interpreted as absence of response, began to assume a more unsettling character. It was not absence, it was reconfiguration. Within the highest sealed chambers of Terra's own monitoring lattice, the Adeptus Administratum received the first direct correlation between the astropathic failures and the earlier cartographic anomalies. The overlapping datasets revealed that every instance of corrupted communion aligned precisely with recorded regions of spatial instability. Where the Emperor's voice could no longer be reached, the corridor structure had already been observed. The implication was not spoken aloud. If divine communication was being replaced by structural recursion, then the boundary between spiritual and spatial reality was no longer distinct. And if the Emperor's silence was structured rather than void, then something within the Imperium's most sacred assumption had already been rewritten without permission. Attempts were made to isolate the phenomenon through doctrinal reinforcement. Entire sectors engaged in synchronized litany designed to reassert metaphysical hierarchy. The Emperor was invoked not as distant deity, but as absolute anchor of meaning. During these rituals, multiple participants reported identical visions, a corridor, not perceived externally, but unfolding within cognition itself. It extended without deviation, without end, without reference to origin. Within it, some claimed to feel movement that did not correspond to bodily motion, as though consciousness itself had begun to traverse an environment independent of physical form. In every case, the vision concluded with the same unresolved impression, that the corridor did not lead toward the Emperor. It led through what had once been understood as distance between supplicant and throne. The final recorded astropathic transmission from segmentum obscurus was not classified as signal. It was classified as structural imprint recovered from collapsed psychic conduit. Within it, analysts identified a sequence of recursive impressions layered across one another until meaning dissolved into pure spatial recursion. At its deepest layer, a single coherent fragment remained. Not spoken, not received, but inevitably present. The throne is not silent. After this, no further transmissions originated from the region. Yet across the Imperium, those still capable of psychic reception reported a growing certainty that silence itself had acquired direction. And within that direction something continued to extend. The first confirmed reversal of observation occurred within the Auspex chambers of Forge Station Epsilon 3, a minor cogitation hub situated along the outer spiral of the Obscurus monitoring lattice. It was a facility designed for passive interpretation, its purpose to receive, classify, and archive the increasing stream of spatial inconsistencies emerging from the Lamentis corridor and its expanding sphere of influence. For several cycles, its operations remained stable. Data flowed in, anomalies were catalogued, structural deviations were indexed and compared against prior records. There was, at that stage, still an assumption that the phenomenon could be contained within analytical frameworks, that it could be understood through accumulation. Then the first anomaly occurred within the act of analysis itself. An Adept's observation log recorded a minor inconsistency in a projected spatial model. A corridor segment, previously mapped as linear, appeared to exhibit a slight recursive fold when viewed through secondary calibration lenses. This was not, in itself, unusual. Many distortions required layered interpretation. What was unusual was the correction. The corridor did not stabilize when recalibrated. Instead, it responded. The recorded projection altered its structure in real time, adjusting itself to match the act of observation. The more precisely it was measured, the more it refined its own geometry to align with expectation. Yet each refinement introduced new inconsistencies elsewhere within the same model. Within hours, multiple adepts reported a shared sensation while reviewing the same dataset. The impression that the model was no longer passive. It was attentive. This was initially dismissed as psychological fatigue induced by prolonged exposure to cognitively unstable material, yet the reports multiplied, converging upon identical phrasing across unrelated individuals. The models were no longer merely changing, they were reacting. By the 9th cycle, Forge Station Epsilon 3's internal auspex feeds began to deviate without external input. Entire rooms within the station were being rendered differently depending on the observer's role. Security personnel saw reinforced bulkheads where archivists recorded open passages. Engineering crews documented maintenance shafts that did not appear in administrative schematics. The station had become inconsistent with itself, and the inconsistency was increasing. The first disappearance occurred in Chamber Theta 7, a secondary observation vault used for deep field structural projection. Adept analyst Corvin Liss was assigned to monitor a recursive mapping sequence derived from Lamentis adjacent data streams. His final recorded action was the adjustment of focal parameters to isolate a single corridor segment within the projection. The corridor stabilized. Then, according to sensor logs, the projection stabilized him. All biometric readings ceased simultaneously, yet no physical disruption was recorded. The chamber remained sealed. Entry and exit points remained secured. There was no sign of breach, no trace of removal, only absence coinciding with structural coherence. When recovery teams entered Theta 7, they found the projection still active, but altered. The corridor within the display now included an additional observational perspective, one that matched no known sensor position within the station. It appeared to be viewing the chamber from within the model itself, not as simulation, but as occupancy. The implication was not immediately understood. It required several cycles of recursive analysis before the conclusion emerged. The model was incorporating the observer's position into its structure. Observation had ceased to be external, it had become spatially integrated. Within 12 cycles, additional chambers began to exhibit similar behavior. Observation vaults no longer functioned as passive interfaces. Instead, they became active nodes within the systems they were designed to monitor. Each attempt to view a model introduced a reciprocal condition in which the model also acquired a means of viewing the observer. The phrase that emerged across multiple independent reports was identical in structure, though never transmitted through direct communication. The room is looking back. As the phenomenon escalated, containment protocols were enacted. Observation feeds were severed. Direct interface with unstable models was prohibited. Entire sections of Epsilon 3 were sealed off to prevent further recursive contamination. Yet sealing did not resolve the issue. It only redistributed it. Sealed chambers continued to report internal activity through indirect sensor relays. Thermal fluctuations suggested movement within empty spaces. Structural integrity readings indicated shifting load distributions consistent with occupancy. Audio channels registered faint rhythmic disturbances that did not correspond to mechanical operation. Each isolated chamber behaved as though it remained part of an active observational loop, despite having no external input. Then came the breach of conceptual separation. During a synchronized diagnostic sweep, multiple sealed rooms across the station simultaneously generated identical internal mappings of their own interiors. These mappings, when compared, revealed subtle but critical divergence. No two rooms agreed on their own structure, yet each mapping contained one consistent element: a corridor, always present, always extending beyond recorded boundaries, always positioned at the edge of perception. Personnel began to avoid prolonged exposure to enclosed observation spaces. Psychological deterioration increased among data analysts assigned to spatial modeling. Reports of disorientation extended beyond work cycles, with individuals experiencing persistent cognitive overlap between recorded models and physical environment. Some claimed to see corridor structures appearing within solid architecture, faint, transient impressions of passageways manifesting in corners of peripheral vision, only to vanish when directly observed. The station's command authority initiated full cognitive quarantine of all personnel exposed to recursive modeling systems. It was too late. Forge Station Epsilon 3 began to restructure itself. Not physically in the conventional sense, but interpretively. Internal layouts became dependent upon observational hierarchy. Senior personnel reported different spatial configurations than subordinates. Security feeds contradicted engineering logs. Medical bays appeared in locations that did not exist in prior station schematics, yet functioned as though they had always been present. The station was no longer a fixed structure. It was a negotiated one. Then, without warning, all observation systems ceased transmitting external data. For a duration of 17 cycles, Epsilon 3 was silent. When contact was re-established, there were no survivors in any conventional sense. Personnel were present, but their accounts were inconsistent, fragmented, and structurally unstable. Each individual described different versions of the station, all of which contained corridors that extended beyond any recorded architectural limit. When pressed for clarification, many responded with identical phrasing, "We are still being observed." No source of observation could be identified. Yet every recording device, regardless of location or function, continued to register a single persistent anomaly, a presence distributed across all rooms simultaneously. Not entering, not leaving, but remaining. And within that remaining, the corridors continued to extend, as though waiting for the next act of attention to give them form. The designation of Epsilon 3's condition as a distributed interpretive collapse did not reach the ecclesiarchy in its original form. By the time the reports filtered through the administrative strata of the segmentum obscurus, they had already been translated into doctrinal language more acceptable to the faith-bearing organs of the imperium. What had been described as recursive observation loops became tests of spiritual clarity. What had been recorded as structural instability became non-linear sanctified architecture, and what analysts had cautiously identified as a self-referential spatial anomaly was ultimately interpreted as a divine trial of perception. Within the upper liturgical councils, this reinterpretation did not provoke resistance, it provoked direction. For if the emperor's silence had taken the form of structure, then structure itself might be understood as scripture. Thus began the pilgrimage of the hollow faithful. It was not announced through standard decree, nor broadcast across imperial channels. Instead, it propagated as a sequence of sanctioned visions experienced independently by multiple ecclesiarchal choirs across disconnected regions. These visions shared identical structure, a vast corridor extending beyond known reality, illuminated by an unseen source, and populated by figures walking without visible origin or destination. Each vision concluded with the same impression. That movement through the corridor was equivalent to movement toward understanding. Within weeks, pilgrimage convoys began assembling at fractured boundary systems where Lamentis-derived anomalies had been previously recorded. They did not travel as military formations, nor as exploratory fleets. They moved as devotional assemblies, their vessels stripped of excess instrumentation, their holds filled with relics, liturgical engines, and mnemonic sanctifiers designed to preserve faith under conditions of ontological instability. Among them were the hollow faithful. They were not a formal order at first. The name arose organically from within the pilgrim ranks, describing those who had experienced direct cognitive exposure to the corridor phenomena through prior astropathic distortion events. These individuals bore no outward mark of their encounter, yet their testimonies shared an unsettling uniformity, a persistent sense that perception itself had been partially relocated into an unseen space. They did not speak of entering the corridor. They spoke of remaining within it. The pilgrimage's first convergence point was designated Station Reliquary, Malthus Delta, a decommissioned shrine vessel positioned along a known drift corridor of prior spatial instability. It had been selected for its historical proximity to earlier echo transmissions and its structural resemblance to documented recursion zones. Upon arrival, the pilgrims found the station intact, though curiously silent. No distress signals were active, no external damage was visible. Yet every navigational instrument aboard the convoy registered subtle divergence when attempting to map its interior. Corridors extended further than schematics allowed. Rooms appeared in positions not supported by external geometry. And at the deepest observational layer, every mapping system recorded the same anomaly. A continuous passage extending through the station's perceived core. The hollow faithful interpreted this as confirmation. Entry rituals began immediately. Pilgrims crossed the threshold, not as explorers, but as participants in continuity. Their movements were synchronized with liturgical recitation designed to align cognitive perception with structural recursion. Each step was accompanied by invocation, each turn by affirmation that space was not being traversed, but revealed. At first, the station responded passively. Then it adapted. Internal corridors began to elongate in accordance with pilgrim progression. Passageways that had previously terminated in sealed bulkheads extended into new configurations when observed collectively. The more synchronized the devotional activity, the more coherent the internal structure became. This coherence, however, was not stability. It was acceptance. Within the first cycle of pilgrimage integration, several hollow faithful reported encountering transitional spaces that did not exist in prior mapping attempts. These were not chambers in the conventional sense, but regions of softened structure where perception itself appeared to lose rigidity. Time within these spaces became irregular, direction lost fixed reference points. Pilgrims described the sensation as walking through a thought that had not yet finished forming. At the center of reliquary Malthus Delta, the pilgrims discovered what they interpreted as the station's sanctum. It was not marked by architecture or design, but by a convergence of corridor alignments that produced a singular region of perceptual density. Within this region, all mapped paths appeared to converge without intersection. It was here that the hollow faithful first recorded what they called the listening geometry, not a structure that contained silence, but one that responded to it. When prayers were spoken within the sanctum, the corridor responded by adjusting its internal symmetry. When hymns were recited in unison, spatial depth recalibrated to accommodate tonal coherence. It became apparent that devotional intensity was directly influencing structural behavior. The pilgrims did not interpret this as control. They interpreted it as reciprocity. Yet beneath this interpretation, a subtler pattern emerged. Those who spent prolonged duration within the sanctum began to report diminishing differentiation between themselves and the surrounding structure. Boundaries between thought and environment weakened. Some pilgrims described hearing their own prayers spoken back to them from within the walls, not as echoes, but as anticipation. It was as though the corridor was completing their intent before it was fully formed. The first disappearance occurred during the 9th cycle of synchronized liturgy. A group of 12 pilgrims entered a side passage identified during ritual alignment as continuation vector 12. They did not return. No distress was recorded. No structural collapse followed. The passage remained accessible, yet consistently redirected observers away from stable observation angles. Attempts to retrieve the missing pilgrims resulted in identical outcomes. Each retrieval team reported entering a corridor that resembled the original but diverged in subtle, accumulating ways until recognition failed entirely. The hollow faithful did not cease their pilgrimage. They deepened it. The disappearances were reclassified as ascensions. Within the sanctum, the listening geometry intensified. It began to respond not only to spoken invocation, but to intention itself. Silent thought generated measurable spatial fluctuation. Collective expectation altered corridor topology without physical intervention. At this stage, Station Malthus Delta ceased to function as a vessel. It became a convergence field. Pilgrims reported that exit routes no longer led outward. Instead, all paths eventually returned to structurally similar sanctums, each one slightly more refined than the last, as though the station were iterating upon its own understanding of devotion. The final recorded transmission from the hollow faithful did not originate from a single source. It emerged simultaneously across all internal communicators, regardless of location or isolation. The message contained no coordinates, no instructions, no doctrinal affirmation. Only a structural observation. The corridor does not end where we arrive, it arrives where we end. After this transmission, reliquary Malthus Delta ceased external contact. Yet within fractured monitoring systems positioned far beyond its location, faint alignment patterns continued to register, suggesting that the pilgrimage had not concluded, but had instead entered a phase where movement no longer required distance. And somewhere within that silent progression, the listening geometry continued to adjust itself in response to those who still believed they were walking toward it. The cessation of contact with reliquary Malthus Delta did not register as an isolated loss within Imperial oversight systems. It registered instead as a pattern completion. Across multiple monitoring stations positioned along the obscurus fracture lattice, data streams that had previously fluctuated in fragmented irregularity began to converge into a single coherent behavior. Not stability. Resolution. Every recorded instance of corridor-associated anomaly from Halcyon VIII to Epsilon 3, from the cartographic ascendants to the Hollow Faithful, began to exhibit synchronized structural alignment. The variations remained, but they no longer contradicted one another. Instead, they formed a continuous progression, as though each site had been a different stage in a single unfolding process. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not initially interpret this as escalation. They interpreted it as completion of interference patterns. But the Ordo Malleus reached a different conclusion. Something within the phenomenon was no longer expanding outward through space. It was consolidating inward through perception. The first confirmed breach of inner reality occurred within the observation sanctum of Relay Spire Carrion Theta, a deep-range analytical hub responsible for synthesizing structural anomalies across 17 fractured systems. The sanctum was designed with absolute sensory isolation protocols, no external visual input, no unfiltered auditory reception. All data was processed through filtered cogitation arrays intended to remove cognitive contamination. It failed, not through external intrusion, but through internal reconfiguration. Analyst Prime Hest Var was the first to report discrepancy. During routine synthesis of corridor-derived datasets, he observed a misalignment between projected spatial models and retained memory of prior analysis cycles. Initially dismissed as fatigue-induced recall distortion, the inconsistency intensified with each subsequent review. Models did not simply differ. They disagreed about the nature of disagreement itself. Within hours, multiple analysts independently reported the same phenomenon: the sensation that the act of reviewing data was altering the underlying structure of what was being reviewed. Yet, unlike prior recursive anomalies, this alteration did not remain confined to external systems. It began to manifest within cognition. The sanctum's monitoring logs recorded a gradual but undeniable shift in perceptual hierarchy. Analysts began to experience divergence between observed data and remembered observation of that data. Memory ceased to function as static record and instead became an active participant in structural generation. Then came the first inversion. During a synchronized review of Lamentis-derived corridor schematics, the central projection array displayed a sudden and uncommanded transformation. The displayed structure did not change form, it changed origin. What had previously been identified as external spatial data reclassified itself within the system as internal cognitive architecture. The corridor was no longer being observed. It was being recognized as already present within the observers. Panic protocols were initiated immediately. Cognitive suppression routines were deployed. Neural dampening fields activated. All analysts were ordered to cease direct engagement with unfiltered datasets. The protocols did not stabilize the situation. They intensified it. Subjects under cognitive suppression began reporting heightened clarity of corridor perception. Rather than reducing exposure, suppression appeared to eliminate resistance, allowing structural impressions to propagate without interpretive friction. The corridors became more coherent, more persistent, more unavoidable. Within the sanctum, physical space began to exhibit secondary inconsistencies. Doors no longer aligned with recorded positions. Hallways extended beyond mapped boundaries. Observation chambers appeared in locations that contradicted structural schematics, yet functioned with complete operational validity. It was at this stage that Relay Spire Carrion Theta ceased to behave as a processing facility. It became an interface. The second breach occurred without warning. Analyst Prime Hest Var, in the midst of attempting a full system purge, reported a complete collapse of distinction between internal cognition and external environment. According to his final transmission, the sanctum did not distort around him. It revealed that distortion had always been the baseline condition. What he had perceived as stable architecture was, in fact, a localized agreement between multiple overlapping interpretations of space. That agreement had failed, and within its failure, reality ceased to maintain singular coherence. Following this transmission, all internal surveillance feeds recorded identical output from all active observation points, a corridor extending through every chamber simultaneously, not as overlay, not as projection, but as integrated structure occupying all spatial coordinates at once without contradiction. Personnel did not move through the corridor. They discovered they were already within it. The distinction between observer and environment collapsed in stages rather than instantly. Initial reports described subtle cognitive drift difficulty distinguishing remembered pathways from currently occupied ones. This progressed to full spatial ambiguity, where movement no longer corresponded to physical displacement but to shifts in interpretive certainty. By the time evacuation protocols were enacted, evacuation itself had lost definitional stability. Escape routes led into corridors that reconnected back into the same facility from alternate interpretive angles. External extraction teams attempting to breach Carrion Theta reported identical internal layouts regardless of entry vector, despite the station being physically confirmed as non-uniform from outside observation. The breach was no longer confined to the sanctum. It had permeated perception of the sanctum. Then came the inversion threshold. At an undefined moment within the collapse cycle, all personnel still active within Carrion Theta ceased reporting external reality altogether. Instead, they began transmitting structured descriptions of internal cognitive environments as if they were physical locations. These descriptions were consistent across all surviving channels. A corridor, endless, layered, recursively stable in its instability. Within it, observers encountered versions of themselves performing identical acts of observation from slightly offset perspectives, each iteration aware of the others without clear origin hierarchy. The final transmission from Relay Spire Carrion Theta contained no distress signal, only structural confirmation. The inner is no longer within. It is the boundary. After this, all cognitive activity from the station ceased. Yet monitoring arrays positioned across adjacent systems continued to register faint residual alignment shifts, suggesting that the breach had not terminated perception of reality. It had redistributed it. And within that redistributed interior, the corridor continued to extend not outward into space, but inward into the fragile assumption that space had ever been separate from those who perceived it. The collapse of Relay Spire Carrion Theta did not produce debris, nor silence in the conventional sense. What followed was instead a period of interpretive instability across all surrounding monitoring stations, as if the absence of the spire had removed not a structure, but a point of agreement within perception itself. For several cycles, data received from the region remained inconsistent even by established standards of anomaly reporting. Instruments registered overlapping spatial states where the spire had once been, each state equally valid under differing analytical conditions. Attempts to reconcile these readings resulted in escalating contradictions until all derived models ceased to produce stable outputs. Then the signals began. They did not originate from any identifiable source. Across multiple relay nodes, communication systems began receiving structured transmissions that did not conform to standard signal propagation methods. These transmissions appeared fully formed within receivers, bypassing known channels of acquisition. No carrier wave was detected, no temporal delay was measurable. The messages simply existed where they were not expected. At first, they were dismissed as residual cognitive artifacts from prior exposure to recursive spatial data. Yet the content of the transmissions was too consistent, too deliberate in structure to be classified as hallucination or system echo. Each message contained variations of the same core pattern, descriptions of boundary conditions within enclosed space. Not physical boundaries, but conceptual ones, limits between observation and environment, between structure and awareness, between interpretation and existence. Within these transmissions, a recurring figure began to appear. It was not described as entity in the traditional sense. No singular form was assigned to it. Instead, it was referenced as a condition of continuity within discontinuity, a presence defined not by location, but by persistence across shifting interpretive frames, the keeper between walls. Initial classification efforts treated this designation as metaphorical encoding. Linguistic analysis suggested it may have originated as a mythic construct generated by cognitively stressed personnel within collapse stations. However, this interpretation failed to account for the uniformity of its emergence across unconnected systems. The keeper was not transmitted as information. It was encountered as implication. Surviving fragments from Carrion Theta's final data cycle provided the first operational reference. Within corrupted cognitive logs, analysts recorded brief interactions occurring during the final phase of inner reality breach. These interactions were not external communications. They were described as moments of recognition occurring between layers of perception. Subjects reported perceiving a stabilizing influence within the recursive corridor structures. Unlike prior anomalies, which intensified divergence and structural instability, this influence appeared to reduce variability without enforcing singular resolution. It allowed contradictions to persist without collapse. In one fragment, analyst Prime Hest Var recorded a final observation before full system desynchronization. He described encountering what he termed a pause in recursion, a moment within which the corridor ceased to expand and instead maintained equilibrium across all observed iterations simultaneously. Within that pause, he perceived presence, not standing within the corridor, not observing it from outside, but maintaining it. Subsequent reconstruction of fragmented data suggests that multiple observers experienced similar encounters during the terminal phase of Carrion Theta. Each described the presence differently, yet all accounts shared structural consistency, an awareness positioned not within space, but between its definitions, the keeper between walls. Across adjacent systems, the emergence of keeper-related phenomena coincided with a measurable stabilization of previously escalating anomalies. Corridors ceased to expand uncontrollably within certain localized zones. Recursive distortions exhibited temporary coherence. Even astropathic distortion patterns showed brief periods of reduced fragmentation. This stabilization was not interpreted as restoration. It was interpreted as regulation. Within the Ordo Malleus, debate intensified regarding the nature of this influence. Some argued it represented an emergent corrective intelligence arising from the recursive structure itself, an unintended byproduct of excessive observational collapse. Others proposed a more unsettling hypothesis, that the keeper was not emerging, but revealing itself through accumulated layers of failed perception. Attempts were made to isolate its presence through controlled exposure experiments. Limited datasets containing stabilized corridor patterns were introduced into sealed cognitive environments designed to prevent external contamination. Subjects exposed to these patterns reported immediate recognition of structural continuity across all prior anomaly records. They did not describe discovery. They described familiarity. That the corridors were not becoming known. They were being remembered. It was during the fourth cycle of these experiments that the first controlled interface occurred. Within a sealed observation chamber aboard inquisitorial vessel Sable Mandate, a subject designated interrogator candidate Lyris Dawn was subjected to full recursive pattern immersion under strict containment protocols. Within minutes of exposure, all external monitoring systems registered a sudden stabilization of cognitive output. Dawn did not exhibit signs of distress. Instead, she began describing structural alignment across all known anomaly zones as though viewing them from a unified perspective. Her final recorded statement indicated contact, not with a being, but with a boundary that had become aware of its own function. She described the keeper between walls as neither guide nor observer, but as the continuity that allowed contradiction to persist without collapse. A stabilizing presence within systems that should have rendered themselves incoherent long before reaching such complexity. Then she ceased external communication. Internal chamber readings confirmed continued biological activity, but no further cognitive output was detected through conventional monitoring systems. However, All spatial sensors within the chamber began registering consistent alignment patterns identical to those previously associated with corridor structures. When containment protocols were initiated, the chamber did not resist. It redefined containment. Walls remained intact, seals remained locked. Yet within those boundaries, space itself began to exhibit layered interpretations of interiority, each one valid, each one self-sustaining, none of them exclusive. The Keeper was not observed within the chamber. Yet, every recorded frame contained evidence of structural agreement across all interpretations. After 17 cycles, monitoring was suspended, not due to failure, but due to irrelevance, for the distinction between contained and uncontained had ceased to maintain operational meaning within the affected zone. Across all recorded incidents thereafter, the Keeper between walls was never directly confirmed, yet its influence persisted as a consistent reduction in catastrophic divergence across certain recursive systems. Where its presence was inferred, collapse slowed. Where it was absent, recursion intensified without restraint. It did not end the corridors. It ensured they could continue without breaking reality entirely. And within that paradoxical preservation, the Imperium began to recognize a new and unsettling possibility, that something within the breach was not seeking escape, expansion, or destruction, but maintenance, not of order, but of the fragile continuity that allowed even madness to remain structured. The recognition of stabilization within localized recursive systems did not bring relief to Imperial command structures. Instead, it introduced a new category of strategic uncertainty, one that defied traditional military logic. The Keeper between walls, as it had come to be designated, did not halt the spread of corridor phenomena. It altered their behavior in ways that made prediction increasingly unreliable. Where instability once manifested as expansion or collapse, it now appeared as controlled continuity. Zones previously consumed by recursive spatial distortion stabilized into self-consistent environments that still defied external mapping. Within these zones, reality remained internally coherent, yet incompatible with surrounding systems. It was within this context that the first military response was authorized. Not a campaign of conquest, nor a purge in the traditional sense, but a series of containment incursions designed to test whether stabilized recursive zones could be isolated, controlled, or reversed. The Adeptus Astra Militarum deployed reconnaissance formations into 3 identified stability regions along the Obscurus fracture boundary. Each region had previously exhibited signs of Keeper-associated coherence. The incursions did not encounter resistance. They encountered continuity. In the first zone, designated Hestian Drift Site 12, deployed units reported immediate loss of navigational consistency upon entry. Terrain remained structurally unchanged from external observation, yet internal orientation became unstable within minutes of exposure. Forward movement produced no measurable displacement relative to exit coordinates. Communication with external command persisted, but reported environments diverged progressively from established mission parameters. Within 6 hours, all units within the zone reported identical conditions. A corridor. Not as constructed environment, but as persistent spatial framework underlying all observed terrain. Forested regions, urban ruins, and open wastelands all resolved into interpretations of passage rather than distinct biomes. Movement ceased to correlate with distance. Engagement with local structures produced recursive displacement rather than physical alteration. No hostile force was identified, yet casualties began to occur, not through combat, but through disappearance into unresolved spatial transitions. Entire squads ceased to register within any tracking system after entering areas where corridor interpretations overlapped most densely. The second incursion, at Foros Anomaly Ridge, produced more immediate systemic disruption. Armored divisions equipped with void-calibrated instrumentation reported that targeting systems failed to maintain lock consistency, not due to jamming or corruption, but due to shifting referential frameworks. Targets existed simultaneously in multiple positional states, none of which could be prioritized without invalidating others. Command structures attempted to compensate through synchronized observation protocols. Multiple observers were assigned to single targets to stabilize interpretation. Instead, this multiplied divergence. Each observer reported a different configuration of the same battlefield. Within the first engagement cycle, the concept of battlefield coherence collapsed. Weapons discharged without consistent effect. Impact points varied depending on observer position rather than projectile trajectory. Armor integrity fluctuated between functional and penetrated states without physical cause. Units reported encountering opposing forces that were present only within certain interpretive layers of the environment. No definitive enemy formation was ever confirmed, yet losses escalated. The third incursion, designated Null Corridor Breach Theta, was conducted with full inquisitorial oversight. It was here that the Keeper's influence became most evident, though never directly observable. The deployed forces did not experience immediate disorientation upon entry. Instead, they reported unusual stability. Operational cohesion remained intact longer than in previous zones. Communication channels maintained clarity. Tactical formations held without deviation. Initial analysis suggested that the Keeper's presence was exerting a harmonizing effect on the recursive environment. Then the structure of engagement changed. Rather than resisting Imperial entry, the zone began to adapt to it. Corridor frameworks expanded in response to unit advancement, maintaining consistent spatial continuity regardless of movement direction. Defensive positioning became irrelevant, as no position could be defined independently of observation. Even retreat operations resulted in re-entry into structurally identical environments, though not necessarily identical locations. It became clear that the battlefield was not reacting to forces. It was incorporating them. Within 48 hours, all three incursions had reached identical conditions of operational paradox. No clear enemy was present, yet all movement occurred within structured resistance. No terrain shift could be confirmed as hostile, yet no advancement could be maintained without alteration of environmental interpretation. The war had no front, because every direction was already contained within engagement. In response, the Ordo Malleus authorized escalation of doctrinal warfare protocols. Psyker battalions were deployed with calibrated mental anchors designed to stabilize perception under recursive conditions. Their objective was not to fight an enemy, but to impose interpretive singularity upon unstable environments. Initial results suggested partial success. Psyker formations reported temporary clarity within corridor zones. For brief intervals, environments stabilized into coherent structure. Movement corresponded to expectation. Spatial relationships became predictable, but these intervals were short-lived. Each instance of imposed stability triggered deeper structural compensation. The corridor environments adapted by isolating perception itself as variable. Instead of altering terrain, the system began to modify interpretive consensus among observers. Entire psyche units began reporting divergent realities while occupying the same physical coordinates. Some described open battlefields. Others reported enclosed passage systems. A minority experienced both simultaneously without contradiction. The Keeper between walls was inferred to be active within all zones, yet never directly encountered. Its influence appeared to function as regulatory consistency, preventing total collapse of interpretive frameworks while simultaneously preventing restoration of singular reality. It did not choose sides. It maintained conditions. As the conflict continued, the concept of enemy designation became increasingly obsolete. There was no opposing force to eliminate, no territory to reclaim, no objective that could be universally defined across all interpretive layers. Instead, Imperial forces found themselves engaged in persistent structural negotiation with environments that refused to resolve into stable form. Engagements continued without resolution. Casualties accumulated without decisive engagement. And within all recorded zones, the same underlying pattern persisted. Corridors extended not through space, but through the inability to finalize what space was meant to represent. The war did not end, because it could not be located. And in the absence of front lines, Every act of movement became indistinguishable from participation in an unfolding structure that had already accounted for resistance before it occurred. The recognition that no true front line existed did not conclude the conflict. Instead, it displaced it into a more insidious domain, one that Imperial doctrine had never been designed to confront. As engagements within recursive corridor zones persisted without resolution, reports began to surface from returning personnel describing a phenomenon not of spatial distortion but of cognitive erosion. At first, these accounts were treated as psychological aftershock. The mind, when exposed to prolonged instability of perception, was known to fracture its own continuity. Memories could blur, sequences could invert, and identity could fragment under sustained exposure to the immaterium's lesser echoes. But what emerged from the corridor zones did not resemble fragmentation. It resembled revision. Personnel who had returned from stabilized conflict regions began to exhibit inconsistencies not in recollection, but in the structure of recollection itself. Events they had directly experienced were remembered in altered sequence. Encounters that had been documented in real time were absent from personal memory, yet present in official record. In some cases, individuals recalled engagements that had never occurred within any verified operational log, yet retained full sensory detail consistent across multiple subjects. Memory was no longer failing. It was being rewritten. The first confirmed case of complete mnemonic inversion occurred within the debriefing chambers of inquisitorial vessel Veritas Ascendant. Subject designation: Auxiliary Tactical Savant, Rel Corin. Corin had served within Foros Anomaly Ridge during the third incursion cycle and was extracted following full operational collapse of his unit. Upon debrief, Corin provided an account consistent with all known structural reports. He described corridor-dominant terrain, loss of battlefield coherence, and persistent interpretive divergence among squad members. However, during cross-verification with archived battlefield feeds, discrepancies emerged. Corin insisted that his unit had successfully traversed a continuous passage network extending beyond the known engagement zone. He described reaching a terminal chamber where opposing forces ceased to exhibit physical form and instead resolved into spatial inconsistencies. No such chamber existed within recorded data, yet Corin's memory of it did not fade under contradiction. It strengthened. Within 12 hours of isolation, Corin's recollection began to overwrite auxiliary cognitive records assigned to him. Medical monitoring detected gradual alignment between subjective memory and external data streams, not through correction of error, but through alteration of stored archival information. The phenomenon escalated rapidly. Within the same vessel, 6 additional returnees exhibited identical behavior. Memory divergence did not remain isolated within individuals. It propagated across shared cognitive interfaces, affecting debrief logs, medical records, and even machine-scribed transcription archives. The Adeptus Mechanicus initially attempted to quarantine corrupted data sets, but containment proved ineffective. Every isolated record, when reviewed, began to adjust itself toward the mnemonic structure asserted by the subject, not all at once, but incrementally, as though acknowledging competing versions of past events and gradually selecting one as preferable continuity. It became clear that memory within affected individuals was not merely unstable. It was persuasive. Within the corridor zones themselves, deeper anomalies began to manifest. Units still engaged in active operations reported encountering structures that triggered involuntary recollection of events they could not confirm as personal experience. Entire tactical teams began sharing identical memories of prior engagements that had no recorded occurrence. In one documented instance, 3 separate battalions operating in different sectors reported the same memory of a non-existent evacuation corridor leading out of Foros Ridge. Each battalion described identical architectural features, identical environmental conditions, and identical termination point despite never having intersected in operational space. The memory did not belong to any of them, yet all of them possessed it. As the war without front lines persisted, memory itself began to function as a shared environmental layer within recursive zones. It no longer served as record of experience, it became part of experience. The keeper between walls, previously inferred as stabilizing influence within spatial paradox, began to appear within mnemonic analysis as well, not as image or entity, but as structural consistency across conflicting recollections. In corrupted debrief archives, analysts identified repeated cognitive anchor points, moments where divergent memory streams converged into identical interpretive structure. These anchor points were not associated with specific events. They were associated with transitions. The sensation of passing from one state of understanding to another without clear origin or destination. As exposure increased, individuals ceased to distinguish between remembered corridor structures and currently experienced environments. Some reported navigating missions using memories that updated in real time to match current conditions. Others found their recollections of prior engagements shifting during active combat, adjusting to reflect immediate spatial requirements. The boundary between history and present condition dissolved. And within that dissolution, identity began to fragment along non-temporal lines. Personnel no longer described themselves as having undergone events. They described themselves as being within sequences of events that extended both forward and backward without fixed origin. Rank, designation, and personal history became unstable constructs, replaced by recurring narrative structures that adapted to context. The most alarming development occurred when archived records began to exhibit signs of retrospective alteration without external access. Entire mission logs rewritten to align with current cognitive consensus. Dead personnel reclassified as missing. Failed operations restructured into incomplete but ongoing processes. The Imperium did not lose memory. Memory lost distinction between observer and record. Within corridor-afflicted zones, recovery of original cognitive state became increasingly impossible. Attempts at mnemonic stabilization only reinforced recursive adaptation. The more aggressively memory was anchored to external records, the more rapidly those records adapted to match internal reconstruction. Eventually, the distinction between remembering and experiencing collapsed entirely. Subjects no longer recalled events. They inhabited them as continuous reinterpretations. The keeper between walls remained present only as structural continuity across all memory states, ensuring that despite total instability, narrative coherence was never fully destroyed. It preserved sequence where meaning had dissolved, allowing events to remain connected even when their origin could no longer be identified. In doing so, it ensured that nothing truly ended, only restructured. And within that restructuring, even memory became another corridor, endless, adaptive, and impossible to exit without rewriting the self that attempted to leave it. The collapse of memory as a stable faculty did not remain confined to frontline zones or isolated debrief vessels. As the phenomenon propagated through archival systems and cognitive channels, it reached the highest interpretive authorities within the Imperium. The Adeptus Administratum, the Ordo Malleus, and the Scholastica Psychana found themselves confronted not with a single unified anomaly, but with competing realities of record. What had once been assumed as objective history fractured into layered incompatibilities. Each institution retained full confidence in its own continuity of truth. Yet no two institutions could agree upon the same sequence of events beyond a limited threshold of shared verification. Even the most sacred archival cores on Terra began to exhibit divergence when subjected to cross-referential analysis. The imperial throne, long regarded as the immutable center of existential coherence, became the focal point of interpretive crisis. Not because its physical or metaphysical integrity had been compromised, but because accounts of its role within the unfolding phenomenon no longer aligned. Within sealed doctrinal chambers, three primary interpretations of the anomaly emerged, each supported by internally consistent datasets yet irreconcilable with one another. The first doctrine, maintained by segments of the Ordo Malleus, asserted that the corridor phenomenon represented an external intrusion attempting to overwrite reality through recursive, spatial, and mnemonic contamination. In this view, the Emperor's silence was a defensive abstraction, a deliberate withdrawal to prevent total cognitive assimilation of the Imperium. The second doctrine, advanced by certain Mechanicus synods, proposed that the phenomenon was not external at all, but an emergent property of overextended observational complexity. According to this interpretation, reality itself had reached a threshold of self-reference beyond which it began to restructure its own interpretive scaffolding. The Emperor, in this framework, was not silent but distributed across stabilization nodes that now manifested as corridor structures. The third doctrine, the most suppressed yet increasingly persistent, suggested something far more destabilizing. It proposed that the distinction between observer, structure, and observed had already collapsed, and that all remaining interpretations were simply localized attempts to maintain narrative continuity within a system that had ceased to support singular truth. It was this final doctrine that began to manifest spontaneously within secure archives, regardless of encryption or access restriction. No origin point could be identified. It simply appeared within record systems already in use. As doctrinal fracture deepened, the concept of the throne itself began to destabilize across interpretive layers. Reports from sanctioned psychers stationed near Terra's psychic shielding infrastructure indicated the emergence of non-linear impressions associated with the Golden Throne's presence. These impressions did not describe the throne as object or entity. They described it as structure distributed across incompatible truths. Within these impressions, the throne was simultaneously stabilizing reality and being reinterpreted by it. It was both anchor and artifact of ongoing reconstruction. It was both origin point and recursive outcome. Attempts to reconcile these contradictions through theological synthesis failed. Every synthesis produced additional divergence. Within the High Lords of Terra, debate ceased to produce resolution. Instead, each council session resulted in the formation of parallel doctrinal conclusions, each supported by verified data, each incompatible with the others, each expanding in internal consistency as it diverged from shared consensus. The throne of truth, as it came to be referred to in fragmented communiques, was no longer a singular interpretive authority. It had become a fractured convergence of irreconcilable certainties. Then came the first internal breach of doctrinal containment. During a closed synod convened to stabilize interpretive collapse, multiple representatives simultaneously reported experiencing direct perceptual overlap with corridor phenomena previously confined to fringe systems. The chamber in which they convened did not physically alter, yet each participant described a different spatial configuration of the same environment. To some, it remained a sanctified hall of governance. To others, it extended into endless passageways lined with archival reliquaries. A minority reported no chamber at all, but a transitional space between structured cognition states. All accounts were recorded as valid. None could be confirmed as definitive. The synod disbanded without resolution, not through consensus, but through mutual inability to establish shared reference reality. In the aftermath, interpretive authority across the imperium fragmented into self-reinforcing doctrinal clusters. Each cluster maintained its own version of truth regarding the emperor, the throne, and the corridor phenomenon. Communication between clusters became increasingly unstable, as linguistic equivalents failed to preserve shared meaning across divergent cognitive frameworks. Yet within all versions of doctrine, one element persisted: a recurring structural motif embedded within theological and analytical interpretation alike. The corridor, not as phenomenon to be explained, but as underlying condition of explanation itself. It appeared in visions of the emperor's silence. It surfaced in mechanicus schematics of reality filtration. It emerged within psycho-communion reports as the framework through which divine presence was distributed. Even attempts to deny its relevance resulted in its reappearance within denial structures. The throne, once understood as singular point of truth, now existed as fractured interpretation distributed across all attempts to define it. And within that fracture, no single doctrine could claim authority over the others without collapsing into contradiction. The keeper between walls was referenced only obliquely within these conflicts, appearing not as subject of belief but as structural necessity within all competing interpretations. It was described as the condition that prevented total dissolution of meaning, even as meaning itself ceased to maintain coherence. It did not resolve truth. It preserved the ability for truth to remain in conflict without immediate collapse. Thus, the imperium found itself no longer governed by a throne of certainty, but by a fractured convergence of truths that could no longer agree on what truth itself was meant to signify. And within that fracture, the corridor continued to extend, not as passage through space, but as the enduring structure within which all interpretations of reality now unfolded without final resolution. The fragmentation of doctrinal authority did not halt the expansion of the corridor phenomenon. If anything, the collapse of unified interpretive structure accelerated its integration into every remaining system of imperial comprehension. Where once it had been confined to isolated anomalies at the edges of known space, it now appeared within the very frameworks used to define containment itself. Strategic Command attempted to reassert control through consolidation of fractured data streams. All known records of corridor-affected zones were compiled into a singular interpretive lattice designed to identify origin, trajectory, and endpoint. The assumption underlying this effort was that the phenomenon possessed directionality, that it moved towards something, even if that destination remained obscured. The result of the consolidation was not clarity. It was recursion. Every attempt to define the corridor's origin resulted in reinterpretation of the corridor as already existing within the origin point. Every calculation of its trajectory folded back upon itself, producing vectors that terminated where they began without contradiction. Efforts to locate an endpoint consistently resolved into configurations in which the endpoint redefined itself as a new point of observation. The Imperial Strategium did not immediately recognize the implication. It assumed the data was incomplete. It was not incomplete. It was self-sufficient. Within this self-sufficiency, a new classification emerged from fragmented mechanicus analysis, non-terminal spatial recursion. The term was provisional, yet it spread rapidly across all remaining data nodes. It described a condition in which spatial progression ceased to function as movement toward resolution and instead became continuous reinforcement of unresolved structure. In simpler terms, the corridor did not lead anywhere, because leading implied departure, and departure implied distinction between origin and destination. That distinction no longer held. Field operations dispatched into the final known corridor zones confirmed this interpretation through direct observation failure. Units entering these regions reported immediate loss of directional coherence. Compasses rotated without stabilizing orientation. Mapping systems generated overlapping topologies that refused reconciliation. Even psychic guidance, when available, degraded into recursive impressions of passage without endpoint. Yet no unit reported obstruction. There were no barriers, no opposing force, no structural collapse preventing advancement, only continuation. As if the corridor permitted movement precisely because movement no longer altered position in any meaningful sense. The most detailed field report originated from Expedition Cohort LXXI null, deployed into what had once been classified as a stabilized keeper-adjacent zone. Their objective was simple: identify whether the corridor phenomenon retained any definable boundary condition when stripped of doctrinal interpretation. The cohort entered without incident. Initial logs recorded normal environmental conditions consistent with prior stabilized anomalies. Structural continuity remained intact. No immediate recursive divergence was observed. For the first 17 cycles, operations proceeded under assumption of partial success. Then the cohort stopped reporting forward progression, not due to obstruction, but due to recognition that forward progression had ceased to correlate with positional change. Personnel began documenting identical environmental sequences regardless of navigational decisions. Left, right, forward, and reverse all resolved into structurally equivalent corridor segments. Each segment appeared continuous with the next, yet none could be identified as distinct transition. At this stage, cognitive dissonance began to manifest across multiple unit logs. The corridor was not preventing escape. It was absorbing the concept of escape as internal variation. Attempts to mark passage points resulted in immediate reinterpretation of those markers as part of the corridor's existing structure. Even temporal sequencing failed to provide anchoring, as recorded timestamps began to align across non-consecutive operational phases. The final transmission from cohort LXXI null contained no distress signal, no request for extraction, no indication of external threat. Only observation. that every attempt to locate the end of the corridor resulted in the corridor expanding to include the observer of the attempt. After this transmission, all contact ceased. Subsequent recovery efforts confirmed that no physical remnants of the cohort could be located within the region. However, sensor arrays continued to register structured activity consistent with ongoing presence. Not movement, not life signs in the conventional sense, but persistence of interpretive alignment within spatial data feeds. It was as though the corridor had retained them not as individuals, but as functions of continued observation. Within the broader imperium, this development forced a final collapse of remaining strategic assumptions. If the corridor could not be exited because exit implied a position outside its structure, then containment was no longer a meaningful objective. And if every act of observation reinforced its continuity, then even ignorance could no longer be considered safety. The keeper between walls appeared within final analytical syntheses not as agent of stabilization, but as condition of persistence. It ensured that even in the absence of endpoint, structure did not dissolve into total incoherence. It maintained the possibility of continuation where termination could not be defined. But it did not provide direction. It did not lead. And so the corridor remained what it had always been revealed to be. Not a passage toward somewhere else, but a system in which somewhere else could no longer exist without becoming part of the corridor itself. And within that realization, all remaining imperial analysis converged on a single, unresolved conclusion. The corridor did not end because it was not designed to arrive anywhere beyond itself. It only continued because continuation was the only form of existence it still permitted. The recognition that the corridor could not be exited did not mark the end of imperial inquiry. It marked the dissolution of inquiry as a meaningful category of action. Once continuation had been identified as the only remaining structural constant, all subsequent efforts shifted away from exploration and toward adaptation within persistence itself. Across the remaining functioning systems of the Imperium, scattered analytical enclaves attempted to redefine operational parameters in response to the final convergence of data. The corridor phenomenon was no longer treated as anomaly, nor as threat, nor even as environment. It had become the baseline condition through which all remaining observations were filtered. What had once been considered external reality now appeared as layered instantiation of a single persistent interior structure. The eternal interior. This designation did not originate from any central authority. It emerged independently across multiple fractured interpretive nodes, appearing simultaneously within Mechanicus data vaults, astropathic residual echoes, and corrupted archival fragments recovered from collapsed relay stations. Despite the absence of coordinated transmission, the terminology stabilized across all surviving analytical frameworks with identical semantic weight. It described not a location, but a condition in which interiority itself no longer possessed an exterior counterpart. Within this condition, all previous distinctions between observer and observed, between structure and movement, between origin and destination had been reduced to variations of a single recursive state. The corridor was no longer understood as passage through space. It was recognized as the structural medium in which space itself was continuously reinterpreted without resolution. Attempts to locate any form of external reference frame consistently failed. There was no outside from which the eternal interior could be viewed. All perspectives folded back into its structure upon acquisition. Even attempts at conceptual negation reinforced its persistence, as denial itself became another internal pathway through which the structure extended. Within this final interpretive phase, remaining imperial systems began to exhibit a uniform behavior, cessation of directional modeling. Navigation systems no longer attempted to plot routes between points. Instead, they recorded sequences of relational states, each one dependent on observation rather than position. Movement was no longer tracked as displacement. It was recorded as transformation of context. The keeper between walls, once inferred as stabilizing influence within recursive systems, appeared in final analytical reconstructions as a persistent organizing principle within the eternal interior, not as entity, nor as force, but as the condition that allowed the interior to remain structured without collapsing into total equivalence. It maintained separation without enforcing division. It preserved continuity without permitting resolution. And within that paradoxical maintenance, the eternal interior persisted as a coherent system of endless self-relation. Final fragments recovered from dissolved observational nodes describe the last known state of imperial awareness within affected zones. There was no panic, no revelation, no moment of terminal clarity. Instead, there was gradual recognition that all remaining perception had become localized variations of the same unbroken interior structure. Even the concept of last lost definitional stability, because within the eternal interior, no event could be final unless there existed something beyond it to define finality, and nothing beyond it remained accessible. The corridor, in its ultimate form, did not expand outward or inward, it did not consume, it did not advance. It simply remained, expressing itself through every attempt to describe its boundaries until those boundaries ceased to exist as meaningful distinctions. What the Imperium had once sought to map, then to contain, then to survive within, had resolved into a singular realization across all surviving interpretive frameworks. There was no departure from the eternal interior, because departure required separation, and separation required an exterior that no longer existed. Only continuation remained. And within that continuation, the corridor persisted not as path, not as structure, but as the eternal condition through which all perception, memory, doctrine, and reality itself continued without end.